Welcome to the What's Important Now program. We are fighting for the soul of America and tackling the tough topics. Now let's join your host, international evangelist and veteran radio host, Tom Sears.
Welcome inside of this week's edition of What's Important Now. I'm Tom Sears, and I want to thank you for being here with us, and I am ready to get this program moving right along, so let's take care of the necessary things first. You can find us on Facebook. We also have a Twitter account, at TSearsWinRadio, at TSearsWinRadio. Would love to have you follow us there on Twitter. You can send us an email, what'simportantnowradio@gmail.com. what'simportantnowradio@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you, and if you're looking for our mailing address, it's What's Important Now Radio, 8901 Good Hope Pike, Lost Creek, West Virginia, 26385. Okay, let's move right along, and I'm going to bypass the American Minute this week, although I love it. Because I want to be able to get into this content as quickly as possible. There has been for many, many years in our country a controversy that began with a term called separation of church and state. I'm not going to dissect that today. I've already done that on previous programs. I do encourage you to go to blogtalkradio.com/What's Important Now and listen to our program, I should say, about the separation of church and state, and you'll get the answers that you need. But let me sum it up by saying it's a figment of a lot of people's imagination. And in part today, we'll prove that once again on this radio program. But there's a controversy, the controversy of separation of church and state, that God has no place in our society, in our public arenas. And that includes our public school systems. That is what they say. There have been multiple rulings that have come from the Supreme Court that in many ways seem to support that idea. And so what I want to do today, because I know this is a concern to a lot of people, I want to take a look back. Because as our former President Woodrow Wilson once said, it's impossible to know where you're going unless you know where you have been. And if you know where you have been, then you have a decision to make about changing where you are going as it pertains to your future. So, I want to take a look back at where we have been as it pertains to prayer and Bible reading in the public school system. And if we have time today, I'm actually going to go through a timeline of the sort of the evolution of the way things have changed in our country. If you go all the way back to colonial America, and in many cases, when you think about the settlements and different things, you have a lot of homeschooling or schools run by churches. And so that doesn't necessarily seem to apply to what we're talking about today, but I do want to start there because it is the foundation. And the Bible says that we need to be careful about how we build upon one's foundation, and I believe that we as America today are treading on some very, I don't know how to say it, but we are treading on thin ice maybe, because we are not building on the same foundation. It's like we're trying to knock the foundation out from underneath of us, and it's just simply not going to work. The thing that I find interesting is that our founding fathers warned us of this. But anyway, if you go back to colonial America, you find homeschooling and schools run by churches. It was very common in that time. And the first settlers in America, they felt that it was extremely important that their children learn to read. That seems like a logical thing. I mean, parents want their children to be able to read, but they had even a deeper reason as to why they wanted their children to read, and it was so that they could read the Bible. And they believed that the Bible was the best teacher of morality, and that by reading the Bible, guess what? They will learn right from wrong. And they would develop good moral character. And they believed, they being the early settlers, believed that the Bible and prayer was a natural part of life. It was a natural part of school life. And they believed that it was even more important than learning reading, writing, and arithmetic. Their basis, their foundation was they learned to read so that they can read the Bible because they wanted their children to be well-rounded with good moral character. Now, as part of daily curriculum, students were taught in that time to read and to use the Bible. If you go forward just a little bit, in 1690, the New England Primer was introduced. Now, that taught spelling, it taught the alphabet, it taught reading, but guess what it used? It used Bible verses. And so not only are they teaching the Bible and morals, but they're getting their education, they're getting their spelling, they're getting their reading, they're becoming more educated. But the New England Primer in 1690 used the Bible verses to do that. And so daily prayer, let me rewind, daily school prayer was just a natural part of that educational system. And then if you go ahead a little farther and you say after the American Revolution, well, Noah Webster, I know you've heard of him, right? He introduced the Blue Book Speller, which was also used, or I should say also used Bible verses to teach reading and spelling. And then, fast forward just a little bit more, in 1836, the McGuffey Reader was introduced. And it also featured Bible verses. And guess what? Moral lessons. Bible verses taught moral lessons. I mean, who can argue with the Ten Commandments? Let's think about it for a moment. We don't want them in our public school systems. We don't want them to, as one judge put it, psychologically damage our children. But, I mean, can you argue with the fact that thou shalt not kill? Thou shalt not steal? I mean, think about it for a moment. What's so psychologically damaging about that? Are we saying that we want our children to have a choice as to whether they should do those things? No. It just doesn't make sense. But we think that it's somehow government infringing or implementing or supporting a particular religion. But I'll slow down for a moment. The school system produced some of the world's, at that time, brightest inventors. And guess what happened? The Industrial Revolution was set in motion. And schools continued at that time to be run mostly by Christian churches until you start getting into the 1890s. And that's when states started to take control of existing schools. And by 1900, many other textbooks were in use. But guess what? They all had Bible quotes in them. So here we are, 1900. As the 20th century began, guess what? Classrooms started each day with the Pledge of Allegiance. And by the way, it included In God We Trust. Just wanted to throw that in there. Or I should rewind and say one nation under God, not our national motto, but one nation under God included in the Pledge of Allegiance. A prayer was included, and a reading from the Bible was included. And churches started to turn over their schools to the state-run educational systems. And state-run schools continued to teach moral values, continued to teach things of the Bible using, as we mentioned, the McGuffey Reader. And it had its Bible verses. And America had one of the best school systems in the entire world. But then something happened in 1925. It was a crack in the wall, so to speak. A crack in the moral school system. the newly formed ACLU, paid a teacher in Tennessee to teach evolution. Now, up until that point, biblical creation was the only thing taught throughout the land. Now, what happened was there was a lawsuit. The ACLU lost. But what happened is it set in motion this sort of reevaluation of everything, especially the teaching of science. And so within 4 decades, the laws were reversed. And so now teaching creation is outlawed and teaching evolution is mandatory. Now, I don't have time. We'll do that one of these days, but we'll attack evolution as well as a theory, not a proven fact. But that's for a later date. We'll leave that there. Now, this prayer, by the way, that was recited went something like this. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee and pray for Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Now, I don't know what is so wrong with that, what gets everyone so upset, other than, in their mind, apparently they don't want to be blessed. And if they don't believe in this God we're praying to, well, then I guess they can just cough it up to us being foolish and silly. But that's not what happened. The ACLU, they continued to fight. And they started fighting this battle in the judicial system. And their goal was to change school policy. And in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled, by using the phrase separation of church and state, that a time for school prayer had to be outlawed. Fast forward to 1962, the Supreme Court ruled again, and they declared that the prayer in school was unconstitutional. In 1963, stopped schools from allowing Bible reading in classrooms or in classes. In 1980, well, that's when the Ten Commandments got kicked out. So while early American schools taught moral values from the Bible with school prayer, today's public school system prohibits teaching moral values from the Bible or even allowing students to pray, unless it's initiated by them, of course. So what has happened? Has there been any consequences to this? Well, yes. You know, I'm troubled all the time to hear the things I hear. But here are some facts. Let's start with some facts. People argue all the time that America has never been a Christian nation, and it's just not true. If you go back and look at historical record, I've shared some of it with you here today, you will find, guess what? America was founded on Christian values. You cannot escape that. There's other things you cannot escape. Like you tried to use Thomas Jefferson as the catalyst for separation of church and state. And if you read his letter, he was trying to ensure that because there was a wall, Christianity would be a part of America's public society, public life. When our founding fathers were discussing Article 1, they were not talking about multiple religions. They were talking about denominations within the Christian religion. Don't take my word for it. Go back and read the congressional record. It's all there. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you something today. We are losing our heritage. Nations are defined by heritage. America seemingly doesn't like it, doesn't like its heritage. for those of us that really believe that America has been great because we have put our faith in a great God, we witness today this removal. But that really doesn't answer whether or not children should be allowed to pray in school. It really doesn't, because law says they can't. Again, and take this in context. A child can bow their head in school and pray, and I don't think anyone's going to say anything. I'm talking about a public display of it, an organized display of it seems to be the problem, where we have seen lawsuits where students have stood up at graduations and prayed, or maybe before a football game, or maybe before lunch. There seems to be this, let's keep God completely out. But when you kick him out, he is replaced. And so now we have to say, excuse me, that our heritage is in fact one that is Christian, historically speaking. Has there been any consequences? Have we seen any consequences since he's been systematically removed from the public school system? And the answer is yes. Test scores, on average, have went down. Teen pregnancy has went up. Sexually transmitted diseases on the rise. So when we read in a book about morality and being pure, it has a way of working on us. But when we're no longer reading it, we blinded ourselves to it, things begin to change. Crime has increased in and out of school systems. Even after Littleton in Colorado, the Board of Education come out and said, listen, we need to get morality back in the school systems. I've done programs on that. I've talked about that. Because we think the problem is guns, they said. I'm summarizing. It's not. We've got to get morality back into the lives of these children. Now, as many of you who have listened to me, you know that I am a guy who believes that God doesn't force himself on anyone, that he is a God that wants us to choose him, and I'm a big believer in that. But when we stand up as a government and we begin to declare that the God that we used to pray to when we needed help during the American Revolution and throughout other wars and throughout other controversies, I want to tell you something. We experienced something in my community a couple years ago where a young man passed away from injuries apparently sustained on an athletic field. And the community and the state came together and prayed. And it was exactly what we needed to be able to stand not only together, but to seek that strength that we cannot find in ourselves. Apparently that's all wrong now. But it didn't seem wrong. It didn't feel wrong then. We needed that strength. Ladies and gentlemen, all around America, we're now telling God we don't need him. Let me give you a timeline, if I can, because I could literally go on with this all day long, but I'm almost out of time already. In 1620, Mayflower Compact signed, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, furtherance of the ends aforesaid. The Pilgrims taught their children the Bible and the Christian faith. 1624, Virginia General Assembly rules that Indian children be rounded up and educated in religion and civilization. 1636, Harvard College is founded by John Harvard, a Presbyterian minister, primarily as a religious school to train clergy in the Christian faith. Harvard, by the way. 1642, compulsory school law passed in Massachusetts called the Old Deluder Satan Law. The law was passed to assure that children could read their Bibles. In 1670, Indian Christian Church founded on Martha's Vineyard to educate Indians. In 1690, Connecticut law passed that children be taught to read so they could read Holy Scriptures. In 1690, as I've already mentioned, first New England Primer is published. The alphabet is taught using Bible verses for each letter and has questions on Bible moral teachings. The primer contains children's prayers, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, the shorter catechism, and questions on the Bible by Mr. Cotton. The New England Primer will be in wide use in American schools of all types, public, private, home, or parochial, for the next 200 years. 1693, Reverend James Blair establishes William and Mary College to prepare students for ministry. 1699, Yale was founded by 10 ministers in order to further the Reformed Protestant religion. Students were required to read scriptures morning and evening at times of prayer. 1717, Reverend Cotton Mather starts classes to teach arithmetic, writing, and pure religion. In 1744, Anglican missionary Samuel Thomas opened school in South Carolina to help further the gospel. In 1745, Yale applicants must recite Vigil, the Greek Testament, and bring sufficient testimony of his blameless and inoffensive life. 1746, Princeton was founded by the Presbyterian with the Reverend Jonathan Dickinson as its first president. Every student had to attend worship in the college hall morning and evening at the hours appointed and had to behave with gravity and reverence during the whole service. 1764, Brown University, established by the Baptists to further the religious revival known as the Great Awakening in America. 1766, Dutch Reformed Church forms Queen's College, Rutgers University, teaching languages, liberal and useful arts, sciences, and especially the divinity, preparing students for ministry. 1769, Dartmouth College is established for the educational and instructional of youths in reading, writing, and all parts of learning which shall appear necessary and expedient for civilizing and Christianizing the children. 1770, California Missions established teaching Indians about God. 1770, Quakers opened school in Philadelphia with religious training. In 1779, Delaware Indians bring children to George Washington for education, and Washington says, "You do well to wish to learn our arts and ways of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ." In 1781, Congress approves the purchase of Bibles to be used in schools. I'm going to read that one again. 1781, Congress approves the purchase of Bibles to be used in schools. In 1783, first Noah Webster Blue Book Speller is published, and its opening sentence declares, "No man may put off the law of God." And I declare that's still true today. This speller is widely used in American schools and is peppered throughout with Bible verses. Later versions stated that Noah Webster, who taught millions to read, but no one to sin. 1784, Jedediah Morse, father of American geography, publishes the first geography textbook, which contains references to Christianity. 1787, Congress passes the Northwest Ordinance, which outlines requirements for governments of new territories so they can even qualify for statehood. Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance directs the people of the territories to establish schools to teach religion, morality, and knowledge. Nearly every state admitted to the Union after this has written in their state constitution wording that the schools are to teach morality and religion, and they all use the Bible as the basis of these teachings. In 1789, Georgetown becomes the first Catholic college in America to serve as college and seminary to train Roman Catholic clergymen. In 1796, in Washington's presidential farewell address, he encourages America to learn biblical teachings to sustain a moral and just country. In 1802, the father of the separation of church and state, Thomas Jefferson, acting as president for Washington, D.C. schools, requires, say that word again, requires the Bible and the Watts hymnal to be used in classrooms. I have always found it interesting that, ladies and gentlemen, that the author of the so-called separation of church and state somehow must be a hypocrite in that he believed the Bible should be in the classrooms. In 1808, Washington's farewell address is published as a separate textbook. Washington's address is looked upon as one of the most important political documents in American history. In the speech, Washington puts an emphasis that for America to succeed, it must have a moral society which can only come from roots in the Christian faith. This textbook was used until 1960s. In 1828, Noah Webster publishes the American Dictionary. In 1830, Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, wrote a letter, and it was published in his letter is published at that time in support of using the Bible as a school textbook. In 1830, First Log Schoolhouse opens in Iowa. 1836, First McGuffey Reader is published, which teaches the ABCs along with Bible verses. The reader is looked at as a reader, which combines instructive proverbs, fundamentals of grammar, and selections of the finest English literature. And it just keeps going and going and going and going and going. I'm going to fast forward to 1900. Virtually all school textbooks published to date have contained biblical references or teachings. 1923, Williams Jennings Bryan argues to limit funds to Presbyterian schools that teach evolution. In 1925, Tennessee governor signs laws preventing the teaching of evolution. Of course, I told you how the ACLU sued. They lost that battle, but would win many others. In 1925, Florida state legislators pass law requiring daily Bible reading in public schools. In 1946, Dallas schools published textbook titled Bible Studies Course for New Testament. This book has many questions and answers about the life of Jesus Christ. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that time set aside for prayer in public schools is unconstitutional. 1954, the words "One Nation Under God" are added to the Pledge of Allegiance. In 1961, there are about 1,000 Christian schools in America. In 1962, the Supreme Court rules that children may not recite a written prayer in school. 1963, Supreme Court bans individual school prayer and Bible reading in public schools. 1965, Supreme Court rules that a child may pray silently to himself if no one knows he is praying, and his lips do not move. In 1980, U.S. schools report the lowest SAT scores ever, after 18 straight years of decline following the 1962 ban on school prayer. 1980, Supreme Court rules that the Ten Commandments cannot be posted in the classroom, for a child might read them, reflect upon them, and then obey them. That was the official ruling. In 1983, President Reagan proposes a constitutional amendment to allow school prayer. In 1984, there are now 32,000 Christian schools in America to counter the rulings of the Supreme Court. In 1985, Supreme Court strikes down Alabama law requiring schools to have a moment of silent meditation at the beginning of the day. In 1987, Supreme Court overturns a state law requiring a balanced treatment of creation, science, and evolution. In 1992, Supreme Court rules clergy may not offer prayer at graduation ceremonies. In 1999, 2 students at Littleton, Colorado High School shoot 11 students. None of these students have ever seen the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, in a public school. In 2000, Supreme Court rules student-initiated or student-led prayer at football games is unconstitutional. 2004, Supreme Court upholds the words "One Nation Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. And in 2008, Christian-run schools and most homeschooling programs continue to produce students with higher academic test results than secular public schools. Ladies and gentlemen, I moved through that rather quickly, but you can just see the transition from the early part of American history into where we are now. And it is referenced in that timeline that negative consequences began when we began to kick God out of our public life and out of our public schools. So this is me reporting it, putting it out there for you. You're going to have to make up your mind and decide for yourself. I know where I stand, and I know what I believe, and more importantly, I know in whom I believe. I want to thank you for taking the time to be a part of our radio program today. Tune in next week as we continue to battle for the soul of America. We believe, as we always say, to fight the good fight of faith, contend for the faith, there is a cause. It does matter, and it is important now. Email us, what'simportantnowradio@gmail.com. Find us on Facebook, on Twitter at TSearsWinRadio. Okay, I've got to go. I feel like I just ran a marathon. But it's important, and it's important to get that information out there. Visit us at blogtalkradio.com/What's Important Now for more radio programs just like this. Until next week, may everything you put your hands to prosper, and may God bless you. Take care.